Have you ever stood at a crossroads, knowing that one wrong step could change everything? Abigail Monroe found herself in that exact moment as she stepped into the old family estate on a stormy night. Her divorce papers were signed just weeks ago, and while the world outside seemed to move on, Abigail felt as if she were frozen in place, caught between the past and a future she couldn't yet picture. The storm outside wasn't just weather, it was a reflection of her own emotional chaos. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder growled low in the distance, making the grand old manor feel both imposing and eerily empty. Abigail had grown up in this house, its wide hallways and creaking floors a part of her childhood, but tonight it felt unfamiliar, like a relic from another life. The lawyer had summoned her and her two siblings, Hazley and James, for the reading of their parents' will. It was supposed to be straightforward, just paperwork to close a chapter, but Abigail had a sinking feeling this night would be anything but simple. As they gathered in the study, tension filled the air. Hazley, the youngest, lounged in an armchair with the casual indifference she wore like armor. Her long, unbrushed hair and paint-stained sweater hinted at her free-spirited nature. James, on the other hand, sat stiff-backed, his neatly pressed shirt and constant glances at his watch screaming impatience. Abigail felt caught between them, as she always had. The mediator, the eldest, the one who somehow had to hold things together, but tonight even she wasn't sure if she could. The lawyer cleared his throat and began. Your parents' estate, including all financial assets and the family home, is to be divided equally among the three of you. However, there is a stipulation. That one-word stipulation made Abigail's stomach tighten. You must come to a unanimous agreement on how to use the inheritance. Whether that means keeping the estate, selling it, or something else entirely, the decision must be made collectively. Until then, no funds will be distributed. Hazley let out a low whistle. Unanimous? That's going to be fun. James frowned. This is absurd. They should have known we'd never agree on anything. Abigail said nothing, her mind racing. The inheritance was meant to be a blessing, but it already felt like a burden. Memories of her parents flickered through her mind, her father's booming laughter, her mother's gentle touch, and she wondered what they would think of this arrangement. But there was no time to dwell. The conversation quickly descended into bickering. Hazley scoffed at James's practicality. James dismissed Hazley's free-spirited nature as childish. And Abigail, already drained from the emotional weight of her divorce, found herself struggling to keep the peace. By the time the meeting ended, nothing had been resolved. The storm outside had quieted, but inside Abigail's heart, the tempest raged on. The morning after the will reading, sunlight filtered through the heavy drapes of the family estate. Abigail sat in the kitchen with a mug of coffee, staring at the overgrown gardens outside. The estate, once pristine, now showed signs of neglect, much like the relationships between her and her siblings. Her thoughts drifted to the divorce again. It wasn't just the loss of her marriage, it was the loss of certainty, of the future she'd once envisioned so clearly. And now, here she was, stuck between two siblings who couldn't agree on anything, and a family legacy she wasn't sure she even wanted. Hazley wandered into the kitchen, barefoot and yawning. Morning, she mumbled, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She looked out the window and smiled wistfully. I used to love this place. Remember when we used to race through the gardens? Feels like a lifetime ago. Abigail nodded, but before she could respond, James entered, briefcase in hand and phone already pressed to his ear. He was mid-conversation, rattling off numbers and deadlines, his presence as sharp and rigid as his suit. Can we talk? Abigail asked once James hung up. Of course. He sat at the table, his posture perfect. Hazley flopped into a chair across from him, slouching in stark contrast. This should be good, she said, smirking. Abigail took a deep breath. We need to figure out what we're going to do with the estate. Mom and Dad wanted us to decide together, and we owe it to them to at least try. James was the first to speak. It's simple. We sell the estate, divide the money, and move on. There's no point holding on to something this big and impractical. Hazley rolled her eyes. Typical. All you care about is the money. This house is more than just bricks and mortar, it's memories, James. It's where we grew up, and memories don't pay the bills, James shot back. Abigail sighed, feeling the weight of their arguments pressing down on her. She didn't want to sell the estate either, but she also couldn't ignore the practicalities. And then there was her own uncertainty. What did she want? The conversation ended with no resolution, just more frustration. James stormed off, muttering about appointments, while Hazley stayed behind, doodling absent-mindedly on a napkin. "You know," Hazley said softly, "I get why you stayed in that marriage as long as you did. You've always been the one holding everything together. But maybe it's time you let go of that." Her words struck a nerve, but Abigail didn't respond. Instead, she stood and walked to the window, staring out at the gardens again. The estate loomed large in her mind, a symbol of everything she had lost and everything she wasn't sure she could hold on to. As the day wore on, Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that her divorce was only the beginning of her journey. The real challenge lay ahead, in the decisions she would have to make not just about the estate, but about herself. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the grounds, Abigail knew one thing for sure: the storm wasn't over yet. The estate's silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards as Abigail paced the study. A mountain of financial documents sat on the desk, a testament to years of neglect that had quietly festered beneath the surface. She had taken it upon herself to sift through the paperwork after Hazley and James had gone their separate ways for the afternoon. Abigail thought she could handle it, but now, staring at the stark numbers on the pages, she felt the full weight of the mess they had inherited. The estate was drowning in debt. Taxes had gone unpaid for years, maintenance costs were staggering, and even utilities were in arrears. Abigail rubbed her temples trying to process it all. How had things gotten so bad? The answers weren't in the numbers, they were in the memories. Her parents had always been proud, refusing help from anyone, even as the years caught up with them. They had poured every ounce of energy into preserving the estate, but in the end, it had become too much for them. Hazley strolled into the study, her hair pulled into a loose braid. She carried a mug of tea and a sketchbook, clearly looking for a quiet corner to draw. "What's all this?" she asked, gesturing to the documents. "Debt," Abigail replied flatly. Hazley raised an eyebrow. "How much?" "Enough that selling the estate might not even cover it all." The color drained from Hazley's face. "You're kidding." "I wish I was," Abigail said, her voice tight. "Mom and Dad were in over their heads, and now it's our problem." Hazley sank into a chair, her sketchbook forgotten. "So what do we do? Sell it like James wants?" Abigail hesitated. She hated the thought of letting go of their childhood home, but she also couldn't see a clear path forward. "I don't know," she admitted. Hazley was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you think this place is worth saving?" Abigail looked around the study, her eyes lingering on the old bookshelves, the worn rug, the faint smell of their father's cologne still lingering in the air. "It's not just about the house," she said softly. "It's about what it represents. Family, memories, legacy. But I don't know if that's enough to justify keeping it." Before Hazley could respond, James walked in, his expression serious. "We need to talk," he said, holding up his phone. "I just got off the phone with a realtor. He says the market's good right now, but we'd have to act fast." "Of course you called a realtor," Hazley snapped. "You didn't even ask us." "I'm asking now," James said evenly, "and I'm telling you that selling is our best option. Unless you two have a better plan." Abigail opened her mouth to respond, but stopped herself. Did they have a better plan? As the tension simmered, Abigail's eyes drifted to the corner of the room where a box of their mother's belongings sat, untouched since her passing. A flicker of curiosity sparked in her mind. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But I need some time." Later that evening, Abigail found herself alone in the attic, the faint glow of a single bulb casting long shadows across the cluttered space. Dust motes swirled in the air as she opened the box she had noticed earlier. Inside were a collection of their mother's personal items: letters, photographs, and, tucked at the bottom, a worn leather journal. Abigail picked it up carefully, her fingers brushing against the soft, aged cover. She sat cross-legged on the floor and began to read. The journal was a window into her mother's mind, filled with entries that ranged from mundane notes about gardening to deeply personal reflections. One entry, in particular, caught Abigail's attention. "I worry about the kids. They've grown so distant from one another, and I fear what will happen when we're gone. I hope this house can bring them together, but sometimes I wonder if it's more of a burden than a gift. Still, I can't let go of the dream that they'll find their way back to each other someday." Abigail's chest tightened as she read. Her mother had seen it all, the cracks, the tension, the unspoken resentment, and yet she had clung to hope. Another entry spoke of her father's determination to keep the estate afloat, even as their financial struggles mounted. "Henry works so hard, but I see the toll it's taking on him. He wants to leave the kids something meaningful, something they can be proud of. But at what cost?" The words hit Abigail like a wave. She closed the journal and sat in silence, her mind racing. The estate wasn't just a house, it was a dream her parents had sacrificed so much for, hoping it would bring their family closer. But now it seemed to be tearing them apart. When she finally returned to the kitchen, journal in hand, Hazley and James were waiting. "What's that?" James asked, nodding to the journal. "It's Mom's," Abigail said. She hesitated, then placed it on the table. "You should read it. Both of you." Hazley picked it up first, flipping through the pages with a mix of curiosity and trepidation. James watched in silence, his brow furrowed. "This doesn't change anything," James said eventually. "We still have to make a decision." "No," Abigail said firmly. "It changes everything." For the first time in years, she saw something shift in James's expression. Not a complete change, but the faintest crack in his resolve. The conversation wasn't over, not by a long shot, but Abigail felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. The kitchen was quiet the next morning, but it wasn't the usual kind of silence. It was the heavy, cautious quiet of three people trying to hold onto something fragilely a tentative truce that could shatter with the wrong word. Abigail poured herself another cup of coffee, her eyes flitting between Hazley and James, who sat across from each other at the table. The journal lay between them, its presence a reminder of their mother's hopes and fears. "So," Abigail said, breaking the silence, "have you thought about what Mom wrote?" Hazley nodded, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the tabletop. "I think she was right about us. We've drifted so far apart, it's like we don't even know each other anymore." James shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. "That doesn't change the fact that we're in a financial hole. Nostalgia isn't going to fix that." "No," Abigail agreed. "But it's not just nostalgia, James. Mom and Dad didn't pour everything into this house just so we could walk away from it. They wanted it to mean something. To us, to our family." James sighed, leaning back in his chair. "And what do you suggest? That we sink even more time and money into a place that's already drowning in debt?" "It's not practical, Abigail." "Maybe not," Abigail admitted. "But selling it isn't the only option. We could renovate it, turn it into something that generates income, a bed and breakfast, an event space, something like that. It could work." Hazley perked up at the idea, her eyes lighting with cautious hope. "That could be amazing. We'd be giving the house a new life, and it wouldn't just be about use it could bring people together, just like Mom and Dad wanted." James looked skeptical, his fingers drumming against the edge of the table. "Do you have any idea how much work that would take? Not to mention the cost." Abigail met his gaze, her tone firm. "Yes, I do. And I know it won't be easy. But it's worth considering, isn't it? Or are you so set on selling that you're not even willing to try?" James hesitated, the conflict clear on his face. He didn't want to be the villain in this story, but practicality had always been his guiding star. Yet something in Abigail's voice, a mix of determination and vulnerability, made him pause. "Fine," he said at last. "I'll think about it, but I'm not making any promises." Abigail exhaled, relief washing over her. It wasn't a victory, but it was a step, And for now, that was enough. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Abigail threw herself into researching renovation options, consulting with contractors, and crunching numbers late into the night. Hazley volunteered to help, sketching out design ideas and brainstorming ways to market the estate as a business. Even James, despite his initial reservations, began contributing in his own way, using his connections to gather cost estimates and legal advice. For the first time in years, the three of them were working together, and yet, the underlying tension was never far from the surface. One afternoon, as they were sorting through boxes in the attic, Hazley stumbled across an old photo album. She flipped through the pages, laughing softly at the images of their younger selves. Hazley, with her gap-toothed grin, James in his oversized glasses, Abigail with her arms wrapped protectively around her siblings. "Look at us," Hazley said, holding up a photo. "We were such a mess." Abigail glanced over and smiled. "We still are." James, sorting through a nearby box, didn't look up. Some things never change. The comment stung more than Abigail expected. She set down the ledger she'd been reviewing and turned to James. "Why do you do that?" "Do what?" James asked, his tone defensive. "Shut us down," Abigail said, her voice rising. "Every time we try to connect, you act like it doesn't matter. Like we don't matter." James froze, his expression unreadable. Hazley looked between them, wide-eyed, clearly unsure whether to intervene. "I'm just trying to keep us grounded," James said finally. "Someone has to." "Grounded?" Abigail repeated, her frustration bubbling over. "You mean detached. You've been running from this family for years, James, and now, when we finally have a chance to fix things, you're still holding back. Why?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken for far too long. James clenched his jaw, his eyes darting to the photo Hazley still held. "Because I'm scared, okay?" he snapped, his voice cracking. "I'm scared that we'll pour everything into this and it'll still fall apart, that we'll fail, that we'll lose what little we have left." The room went silent. Hazley set the photo album down, her expression softening. Abigail took a step closer to James, her anger replaced by something gentler. "James," she said quietly, "we've already lost so much. But we can't keep running from the fear of losing more. If we don't try, we'll never know what could have been." James didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders eased ever so slightly. Hazley reached out, resting a hand on his arm. "We're in this together," she said. "All of us." For the first time in a long time, James didn't pull away. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the photo album. And in that moment, Abigail felt something shift not just in James, but in all of them. The cracks were still there, but so were the beginnings of repair. "You got it. Here's the conclusion," wrapping everything up with a reflective tone, and naturally weaving in the theme of divorce. The air smelled of fresh paint and newly sanded wood. Sunlight poured through the large windows, casting warm golden hues across the newly restored main hall. Abigail stood in the middle of the room, surveying the transformation with a mixture of pride and disbelief. What had once been a decaying estate weighed down by debt and family discord was now a vibrant space filled with possibility. The three siblings had worked tirelessly, sometimes together, sometimes apart, and often stumbling along the way, but they had made it. Hazley appeared beside Abigail, her arms crossed and a smile tugging at her lips. "Not bad, huh?" "Not bad at all," Abigail replied, her voice soft. "It's like the house has a heartbeat again." James joined them a moment later, wiping his hands on a rag. He had been fixing a loose hinge on one of the doors, his usual practicality now applied to preserving the dream they had all embraced. "I'll admit it," he said. "This turned out better than I expected." Hazley let out a laugh. "High praise coming from you." James smirked, but his expression softened as he looked around the room. "You were right, Abigail. This place, it's more than just a house. It's a chance for a fresh start, for all of us." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. They weren't just rebuilding a house. They were rebuilding their family, piece by piece. For Abigail, the journey had been about more than finances or logistics. It had forced her to confront the fractures in her life, both past and present. Her divorce had been a turning point, a moment when everything she thought she knew about love and stability had crumbled. At the time, it had felt like the end of the world. But standing here now, surrounded by her siblings and the echoes of their parents' dreams, Abigail realized that divorce wasn't just an ending. It was a chance to reevaluate, to let go of what wasn't working, and to rebuild something stronger. "I think Mom and Dad would be proud," Hazily said, breaking the silence. "They would," Abigail agreed, her voice thick with emotion. "But more than that, I think they'd be happy to see us like this, together." James nodded, his usual stoicism giving way to a rare moment of vulnerability. "They always wanted us to take care of each other. I just wish it hadn't taken this long for me to realize that." Abigail placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but grounding. "What matters is that we got here, and we're not going backward." The three of them stood in quiet solidarity, their bond stronger now than it had been in years. The house was no longer a symbol of their parents' struggles or their own arguments. It was a testament to their resilience, a physical manifestation of the lessons they had learned about forgiveness, compromise, and love. As the first guests began to arrive for the opening event, a small community gathering to celebrate the estate's new phase, Abigail felt a deep sense of peace. The word divorce flickered in her mind again, but this time it carried a different weight. It wasn't just about the end of her marriage or the separation of paths. It was about the choices we make to let go of what no longer serves us, even when it's painful. It was about finding the courage to start over, and in doing so, discovering what truly matters. "Ready?" Hazily asked, nudging Abigail gently. Abigail smiled, glancing at her siblings and then at the house that now held their shared dreams. "Ready." As the doors opened and laughter filled the air, Abigail couldn't help but think of her parents. Their sacrifices, their hopes, and even their struggles had brought her to this moment. And in the end, it wasn't about the house, the money, or even the inheritance. It was about family, about learning to heal, about choosing to move forward, even when the path wasn't clear. Divorce had taught Abigail that endings were inevitable, but so were new beginnings. And this was theirs.